Well, how do we categorize grains? So there are lots of ways to do it, and one way is simply by absolute size. And this is the common grain size scale that's used for sediments, and for research purposes, this logarithmic transformation, the phi size division, is commonly used. And of course, you can put verbal descriptions, siltstone, onto specific ranges of absolute size. But there are other ways to categorize grains, and one way has to do with the relative size. And people make a distinction here between the relatively larger grains, which they call the framework grains, and the smaller grains that you can put into the intervening spaces. And here again is a term, this term matrix, that's a real problem because different fields of study use it very differently. The field of in engineering applications, you often hear people talking about matrix porosity, and what they're doing is they're talking about the rock versus the fractures. But here in this class, when I say matrix, I mean the finer grained particulate material between relatively larger particles. Even within that definition, there are some variations, and we can talk about detrital matrix, and those are just tiny little grains that could move around in the sedimentary environment and be deposited. There's this term pseudomatrix that relates to a historic problem that people, back in history, a problem that people had recognizing detrital matrix versus matrix or a matrix-like appearance that arose from compaction of ductile mudstone clast or ductile metamorphic rock fragments. So for example, you can see here, these are quartz grains, and we have this little mudstone clast, and you can see that it's in compaction, it's behaved in a really squishy way, and it's been ductily deformed to fill the spaces between the quartz grains. Well, what would happen if you had a whole bunch of those? Well, you could end up with a fabric like this. And in older literature, people didn't realize that this compactional deformation was happening to these fine-grained particles, and they came up with the idea that somehow maybe it was diagenetic. There was the idea of the Greywacke. Well, we've sort of abandoned Greywackies because now we realize that textures like this arise from compaction. So we have detrital matrix that has uniform distribution of uniform material through in the spaces between the framework grains, and then we have so-called pseudomatrix. Even the term pseudomatrix has kind of fallen out of use because people simply recognize what it is, and they say, oh, we have a sandstone with ductile deformation. So again, everything I just said about sandstones also applies to mudrocks. And the challenge, of course, is that mudrock particles are really tiny. Everything in a mudrock would be matrix in a sandstone. But in mudrocks, you have, and again, framework grains, silt-sized particles, even fine sand particles, and between them you have matrix. And if you look at it really close, here in this backscatter image, you get a much clearer view of that. You can see the various silt particles of quartz and feldspar and mica with the finer grained clay-rich matrix in between. Look at it even closer, and you realize that a big portion of the volume that we see here is actually pores, and as we will see later, it could potentially be cements. Another way to categorize grains, so we've looked at absolute size, relative size, and now we're going to consider the origin of grains. Another way to divide grains is into those that come from outside the basin. We call those extra-basinal grains. And ones that are born inside the basin. We call those intrabasinal grains. And so the dominant extrabasinal grains are things like quartz, feldspar, and lithic fragments that dominate the composition of limestones. But of course, another really important extrabasinal material is detrital clay. And of course, there's a wide range of minor extrabasinal grains here, heavy minerals, micas, and terrestrial organic matter. There's also a really wide variety of grains born inside the basin, fossils being probably number one in the list, but you can also have a wide range of intraclast and things like glauconite and phosphate, which form diagenetically and they get reworked as particles, and marine kerogen. So in thinking about extrabasinal grains, we generally use them to make inferences about the tectonics of the source area. On the other hand, the intrabasinal grains serve a very different purpose and allow us to learn something about depositional environment. But a really important point that I want to make is that whether you have extrabasinal grains or intrabasinal ones, they all have widely varying chemical and mechanical stabilities in the subsurface. So the proportions of the different kinds of grains in your rock really provide an important starting point for understanding what's going to happen to the sediment in the subsurface. So once again, I'll make the point that everything I just said really based on sandstones also applies to mud rocks, but here, of course, detrital clay being the key extrabasinal component. And here's some examples. This is Barnett shale with phosphate clast and some organic matter. But it also has feldspars. Look how many feldspars are in the Barnett shale. This blue, these are all feldspars. It's amazing. But just like in sandstones, there's this tremendous range in chemical and mechanical stability of the material.